Hello and welcome to episode 8 of AR Chat. This is going to be a box office episode. We've got our co-hosts as always, Crystal Golightly and Nathan Herman. We were also joined this week by Dan O'Brien, formerly of IBM, now running the show over at the Futurum Group. Dan, great to have you on the show.
Thanks, Stephen. Yeah, I really appreciate you all having me on. Excited to be here.
So I gave a little bit of an introduction there. I think your journey is going to be fascinating for a lot of people. Just tell us a little bit about what you do for the Futurum Group and give us maybe a little bit on where you came from at IBM just to provide some context.
Yeah, sure. Happy to talk through that. As you mentioned, currently with Futurum Group as president and COO. I've been there for a little over 4 months now. Prior to Futurum Group, spent about 7 years leading the Analyst Relations program at IBM. Prior to that, spent about 5 years as an analyst covering the semiconductor space, built a business serving hedge funds and the semiconductor supply chain. And prior to that, spent about a decade in the semiconductor industry in a variety of roles across product management, market intelligence, investor relations, and strategic planning. So it's been a fun journey.
So Dan, how did you get into analyst relations then? So like you said, you have a wide kind
Hey,
of...
Nathan just got off script, right, guys? Like
I
had to give him the job, but it's a great question.
I think it's important for the context of the conversation because you are in an interesting role now, and you come from an interesting past. So for our audience, I'd love to hear that.
Yeah, my story about entering analyst relations really starts with a good short thesis, believe it or not. Was working as an analyst covering the semiconductor space and happened to have a good short thesis on a Taiwanese semiconductor company that we thought was going to really suffer from the China 3G to 4G transition, and that thesis turned out to be right. That put us on the radar of that company. We weren't quite sell side bank, so we weren't IR's problem. We were becoming an AR problem, and that customer, that company turned out to actually find a lot of value in the data that we used to establish that short thesis. Became a customer of ours, and when the AR leader of that company transitioned into their next role, they went to IBM and reached out to me. My company had recently been purchased by private equity and was looking for maybe what was next, and that's kind of how it all went down. So it's an interesting path for sure.
So Crystal, get us back on script.
I know, like many of us, you stumbled into this really delightful world. So, Dan, you tell me, what are your hypotheses on how did this whole thing start called analyst relations? And yeah, what do you think our origin stories are?
As I understand it, analyst relations was started at IBM, many years ago. When I joined, that was, kind of the lore and the story that I was told. But, I think a collection of companies like IBM and HP and Intel, all kind of came to a fairly similar conclusion at a relatively similar time, that there was something going on here. There was unique value that needed a dedicated effort behind it, and that's about how I understand it.
Yeah, that's definitely a
becoming the
common theme.
consensus, right?
Totally.
Yeah, there's many people who could tell the founding story and origin story better than me, but if you want to know where it started, I believe it started at IBM.
Yeah.
I think that gives us a segue into IBM. We know each other from when you were running that program over there. IBM, I was always told, was probably in more magic quadrants than any other kind of vendor out there, just given the breadth and scale of what they did, from consulting through to software, through to hardware, through to a whole quantum, a whole raft. There's probably not a broader. I think that gives you a really interesting perspective. I know we've talked about it in numerous bars around the world. Where do you see this
I have
industry?
no idea what you're talking about, Stephen. No.
Yeah, just deny knowledge. Deny. But no, I mean, all joking aside, I think with Analyst running probably one of the biggest teams, if not one of the biggest teams in the industry with the biggest breadth, and now going to one of the up and coming sort of fast growing analyst firms, be really keen to get your perspective of kind of where do you see this industry going? I know we share a lot of the same opinions of kind of how some of the disruption's happening, but love to just maybe get almost a bit of a monologue from you, and then we can pick that apart and ask a bunch of questions from there.
Yeah, no, happy to. There's a lot in there, so let me try to kind of dissect it and break it down. For the past 7 years, prior to January, leading analyst relations team at IBM, what an incredible opportunity. I mean, as you said, one of the largest teams in the industry. I think, pretty highly ranked by those who rank. I think the IAR and Sage Circle folks have kind of put us in the top three or so, if not number one the past several years. And, really proud of that. An incredible team that was built there, that continues on, the mission today. Really an incredible place to do analyst relations, because as you said, the breadth of market. And, analyst relations has always been a little bit of a funny label to me, because it's not naturally all that inclusive. You can call them analysts, you can call them advisors, we've got influencers, we've got pundits, we've got just so many labels. And I think really the term wants to capture that umbrella of these external voices and companies that have a really unique perspective on the market and are influencing everyone from buyers to media to investors, developers, partners. I think we always took a very kind of broad view of the profession and kind of what it meant. Basically, if there was somebody outside our company who we thought was valuable and could help us, we wanted to kind of include them in the analyst relation program, the way I kind of operated and ran it. You know, IBM was also unique in that, as you mentioned, in the services space, in the software space, in the infrastructure space, in the semiconductor space. And, again, analyst relations is a very broad term. Those are massively different jobs. In the services space, analysts really judge you much more on, how many people you have and how those people are trained and certified and where those people may reside in the world. So it's a lot about capability, and kind of skill set, whereas, software becomes, a little more objective, but pretty subjective, right? How do you deliver? What features do you have? And I think, the type of evaluations you mentioned earlier, kind of excel, primarily, I would say, in the software space. Infrastructure gets even a little bit more objective, and semiconductors, highly objective, right? You can put it in a lab, you can test it. Somebody's more power efficient, somebody is faster, in terms of compute speed. So you've got this really broad range of markets, and while we all call it analyst relations, regardless of what sector you're playing in, it's a very, very different job. And I think that was one of kind of the unique challenges, but also one of the things I really enjoyed about doing IBM at AR was, the ability to kind of see across all of those markets and really deploy a lot of different AR strategies, to get value, out of our activity in each of those spaces.
Dan, I'd love to jump in with a question there. Let's set aside the function of AR that is inbound for a second, so responding to RFIs, managing the different evaluations from the different analyst firms. I feel like in a lot of companies, to me, it seems to fall into kind of one of three big buckets. So there's the AR for amplification. So you could call it AR for PR. I think that's a little bit disingenuous. There's AR for kind of product insights and product development. And then there's AR for sales enablement. I mean, a good program is going to do all those things. A good program often has scale, or at least has built up to a point where they have an infrastructure that enables scale, even if they don't have the headcount. How did you go about things at IBM? Did you focus on one of those three buckets more than others, or operating at the scale you had, which I actually don't know what the headcount at IBM looks like, were you able to kind of do all three of those things and really build that modern insights-driven AR program that sits across the silos?
I think, my mindset was that we really wanted to kind of do it all. And it was really about, turning kind of all the knobs so that, you had the right mix of outcomes, for the part of the business that you were serving, right? So, a very mature part of the business that, is kind of a leader in its market, a cash cow type of business, that's going to be a much different style of AR program than, an area where, it's an emerging market, it's a nascent market. You're really trying to establish yourself early on, as a leader. Very different from a part of the market where, maybe you're a challenger and, you're coming to the market late, but you've got some unique capabilities. So Really depending on kind of the product, the business area that you're talking about. I think we tried to leverage all of those different types of outcomes in terms of the mix at our disposal. And really try to get the right mix for what that business needed. So, really, all of those things are valuable. I mean, I think a good AR program really does strive to kind of bring value across all those different value vectors, but really depends on kind of where the company is at, where the business is at, where an individual product area is at, kind of how you would activate one outcome versus another. But generally speaking, you kind of wanted to do them all, but at different levels of volume, depending on kind of the individual business situation.
Dan, if I could pop us up a little bit, because we're doing a lot of reflection, which is great, because I think people don't always understand that maturity model that I think really is what you're pointing to. And I think you're the first person that I've ever talked to, years ago, obviously, but about the maturity model. But again, let's pop back up. And I would love to know, because now your role is different, right? Now you're seeing a landscape. I would love to get your thoughts, ideas, assessments, whatever, of this sort of different view that you now have, right? From here to here, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I guess first off, I'd say, I'm having a lot of fun in my new role.
That's
I've always,
important.
always it is, yes. But I think in my previous role, I really worked with pretty much every analyst firm out there in the market. Got a very broad view as to the different players out there, the unique value adds that they'd all bring, and a lot of why I came to the Futurum group was that the past several years it's been very clear that they are a riser in the space and a disruptor, and doing things that really nobody else is doing. So I think that's what drew me in here. But to kind of get back to your question, the landscape is changing pretty rapidly. AI disruption, I think, will be very real. The way people consume information is changing pretty quickly. And I think it's the analyst firms that really kind of lean in and embrace that new consumption model that are really I think set up well to continue to succeed into the future.
An interesting question to maybe piggyback off of relating to your new role is we talk about influencer analysts a lot, and I know that Daniel and Futurum, you guys have a vision that is more than just being known as influencer analysts. From that position, though, because Futurum is excellent at the media aspect of analyst relations. I mean, along with someone like theCUBE or SiliconANGLE, you guys are trailblazers on that front. Do you find that you are often dealing with analyst relations teams, or are those conversations being handled by different aspects of kind of the vendor side of the landscape? I'm always curious about that, because one of the things we struggle with on the analyst relations side, I think, is figuring out how much breadth to accept. How far do we go into the influencer landscape? Where does the line between analyst and influencer end and begin? So
yeah, well, I mean, I'd start by asking, does it matter where that line is drawn?
great question.
I think you could spend a lot of time worrying about that, but ultimately it really comes down to whether you see value or not. I think generally speaking, we have a core relationship that really resides in AR. But I think what's unique about us at Futurum Group is that we really serve many different buying centers inside of a tech vendor. Certainly we've invested heavily in proprietary data sets, our intelligence platform. So really in the age of AI, really grounding in strong proprietary data, market models, decision maker data, et cetera. And I think our research and intelligence business continues to really be primarily an AR relationship, and oftentimes spills into MI and CI and strategy and other places. But as you look across our portfolio, we've got a number of businesses that really serve the marketing buyer. Our tech field day business, our tech strong business around events, thought leadership, demand generation, buyer intent. I think we've got some really unique capabilities in Signal 6.5, where we do labs, testing, benchmarking, and that really tends to actually be more of a product and engineering centric relationship for us.
I'm going to dive in, Dan, because I was literally talking about Signal 6.5 to the guys at AWS this week. I was with those guys, and there was a conversation over dinner, and I think you glossed past it. You represented it well in a few sentences, but I think it is genuinely worth kind of double clicking on, because I don't think there's another analyst firm, and I want to maybe check my understanding, that also does benchmarking and testing in the way that you guys do. I think there's benchmarking and testing firms, only a handful of them, but I don't think there's another firm that does that in combination with the other things that are in the AR landscape. So I wanted to double click on it and give you the chance to, because I think it is new and different to a lot of the other AR kind of conversations.
No, I agree with your perspective, Stephen. I think we've really tried to build a portfolio that is unique and that delivers an end-to-end value across all of these different personas inside of the tech vendors that we work with, and really try to create a unique value proposition that layers those incremental values on top of each other into an overall value that is kind of hard to match. But I agree, yeah, nobody's really doing that type of work. I mean, there are a lot of companies out there who will, I'll call it model out, things like cost and performance and value. But the ability to really, take a product, use it as a user would, compare it alongside, a peer set or a, basket of competitors, to drive that, that product validation. Yeah, I think it's a really unique capability, and it's been a great organic, kind of growth vector for us.
What does all this say about the future of analyst relations? I mean, you guys have built quite a unique portfolio. You have testing and benchmarking, you have market amplification services, you have market intelligence services. I mean, I've got my own thoughts on where analyst relations should go and what that should be a part of in terms of a larger piece of the organization. But what does this mean? What would an AR listener, or what would an AR practitioner listening to this podcast take away? What should they be pushing for internally? What should they be thinking about?
I mean, for me, it really starts with, what are your company executives and what is your company looking for in terms of value from the analyst community? And I use that word analyst to mean a very broad, definition of kind of what falls under that umbrella. But, it's pretty simple for me, Nathan, follow the value. There's potentially a lot less value in filling out forms. Maybe do less of that, maybe automate that. I think AR has always done well delivering insight, but I think it does well delivering insight on a fairly narrow field. The people who are on the phone call tend to get a lot of value. How do you scale that to the rest of the company, right? I'd be shifting attention into, all right, how do we democratize the insight that we're bringing in across a broader array of customers within inside, my company. I think as AI takes over, there's a lot of low value work that can be, automated, and we've got to shift our focus into the higher value work. The relationship element is always going to be critical. You've got to lean in there. I mean, I think, we like to say in the era of AI, it's going to matter what, less what is said, but more who says it. There are going to be trusted voices that emerge as the cost of content and the written word effectively goes to zero, where, you're going to really need to lean into the voices that people trust and that have a real audience behind them. And I think, all of those things would serve our practitioner well in terms of, how they think about their job and, their teams and how they move forward.
I want to take you back, Dan, and it's a riff off what you just said, but I think so many of the AR professionals that I speak to want to put people into buckets. And I think something you said earlier that I 100% agree with. You look at somebody like Daniel Newman. He's written 7 books. Is he an author? He's got 50, 60,000 followers on X. Is he a social media influencer? He's a TV pundit because he's on the networks pretty much every week. He's ranked highly in AR Insights Power 100. He's doing a lot of advisory. I think, and I have this conversation not through the lens of Daniel, but he's probably the archetypal kind of rule breaker of those buckets. I think, Nathan, to answer your question and to use sort of Futurum as an example for that, I think it doesn't matter. It genuinely doesn't.
Spend a lot of time debating what bucket to put somebody in. I don't know that there's much debate as to whether there's value there, right? Shout out to my new boss, Daniel Newman. There's a lot of labels you could put on. I'm not sure how much that matters. I tend to think about analysts. You want to really segment them by the types of outcomes they deliver. And I think, there are a rare few analysts out there that really deliver value across a lot of different outcome categories. And, those are the analysts that AR team should be spending, really, their time and money with.
Yeah, I think it comes down to that. If you're going to spend your time, money, and event invite allocation, don't think about the bucket of where somebody is. Just think about the value of what they can bring. Crystal, you were going to say something.
I was just going to say this. I wrote down a note because you had talked about labels before, right? And in some of our chats, we've been talking about, well, actually, it wasn't in this chat. It was in another industry event that I was in. And they were saying that sometimes they feel like the analysts get downgraded because of the term analyst. Because if you look at the financial world, an analyst is more of a junior job. And therefore, that transaction between like sort of a marketing comms analyst or a technology analyst and a financial analyst creates a friction. So just to throw a little curveball at you, because I agree with you, because labels are like whatever, but they do play an important role um, in when you don't have like the report card of outcomes or whatever. So how do you reconcile that?
Listen, I think the primary job of an AR leader is really to educate their stakeholders inside their company. So, to the degree there's any negative connotation associated with the analyst label, I think that's kind of job one in a lot of ways, is to really define kind of who the audience is that we're talking about, and why they're important and the type of value they deliver. But I think I've probably echoed it a few times here. Folks who get hung up on the labels, I generally consider that a waste of time. I mean, I'll use an analogy for you. I probably hired somewhere between 50 and 100 AR pros in my career. One of the disqualifying comments for me in an interview would be, the type of remark like, "Oh, so and so is not a real analyst." That to me shows a very narrow mindset, and to me was indicative of I'm not sure that this person is maybe thinking about analyst relations the way that I think about it, or the opportunity here, and that that mindset may be limiting in terms of what we want to achieve.
It goes back to chasing value, right? You said chase the value. I wanted to, Stephen, I know you had a question, but since we're on the topic of education, I want to throw one thing out there for Dan. What would your advice be to an AR practitioner who might be listening to this, who sits at a company where perhaps the executive team has a very traditional view of the value of the analyst landscape? So being in a magic quadrant gets you kind of on the short list, proverbially for an end user buying decision. And that's kind of the value they attribute to AR. How would you go about up-leveling that conversation or changing the perspective internally to help show that there is a wide variety of outcomes and successes that can be had that aren't in a magic quadrant or a wave or a marketscape?
Yeah, I mean, I think that really becomes the primary job of that AR leader, is to, educate and influence the executive team to appreciate the full opportunity that's there when it comes to working with analysts. That type of mindset that, we only focus on kind of where we are, where our dot is in the box. You're doing maybe a quarter of the job at that point. You're probably not realizing the inbound insight value that can help shape your product and go to market roadmap. You're probably not leveraging the kind of brand awareness and amplification that analysts can bring. You're probably not using analysts as a great source of, marketing content, sales enablement content. You're probably leaving value on the table when it comes to your events and bringing in outside speakers. You're probably missing value when it comes to strategy and M&A teams, and the value that can be derived from market analysis and market intelligence data, market sizing, et cetera. So I think that really becomes the job of an AR leader. And let's be clear, I'm a much better AR leader than I am an AR practitioner. I mean, my team was so much better at the AR job than I ever was. I really embraced the role of, I am trying to make a business case for analyst relations, and, really trying to, be the chief evangelist of the value, of the kind of chief fundraiser, and really, kind of that external, face of the program, and advocate for the analysts, and advocate for my company with the analysts. I think, that's easier said than done in a really small outfit. But, I think that's really where I would encourage AR leaders to focus, is, build your business case. This is an investment just like anything else within your company. It's got opportunity cost, it's got trade-offs. You really need to build a strong case that says we need to invest here. This is what we're going to get for that investment. And, it aligns to kind of the company's goals and challenges.
Nathan, I'll probably answer your question, and it's maybe a little self-serving, but I'll and self-indulgent, but I'll do it anyway. I think that traditional view of analyst relations will lead you to work towards working with 2 or 3 firms. I think what I would advise and get a sort of on the tactical level is go find that one independent that covers your space that's really prominent but doesn't work for the big 3 or 4 firms, and put one of those guys on a call with your executives. Now do a bunch of screening first, lean into that slowly, because they're going to go, this guy doesn't work for a firm that I know or understand or recognize. So there's going to be some cognitive dissonance there. But you will be surprised at the value that boutique independent bring that's so uniquely different than what you're going to get from a guy or an IDC or a Forrester or an Omdia. Whether that's me, whether that's Tim Crawford, whether that's Maribel, whether that's one of Dan's guys, whether that's somebody at the Cube. It really, I'm not pushing any particular firm. Go do the diligence and find the person. I look at Will Townsend in networking over at More Insights and Strategy. I know the HPE guys absolutely rely on Will as a networking guy, because he is so deep and so sort of knowledgeable on that space. There's guys I could mention from somebody like a Ron Westfall in telco. There's so many of these voices that sit outside of the big firms that you put them on an advisory call and they're going to bring such a different perspective that the vendors are going to see
that really the analyst landscape varies dramatically depending on the outcome, right? I think we all know, in terms of buyer influence, there's a particular firm that has a bit of a monopoly there. Insight is highly democratized. Insight can come from anywhere. I think the biggest challenge when it comes to insight is that, any given vendor's demand for insight and ability to consume insight is probably 1/10 of the amount of analysts supply of insight that is trying to be provided, right? So you've got a little bit of a demand supply mismatch there. But you can really find insight from a lot of different places. It doesn't need to be the big firms. It can be kind of the one person shops as well. In terms of market voice, different analyst firms reach different audiences, right? There are certain firms that really carry the voice of the developer really well. Other firms will get you closer to the buyer. Other firms get you, the executives at the partners that you're trying to win. Other firms get you the investor audience, the media audience. So you really got to look at who are you trying to reach, and really, use the right tool for the right job, right? I mean, it's not simple, but there's no analyst firm that is the answer to every question.
Even if maybe a few of those analyst firms want to be the answer to every question, right? There's a difference between using
I don't think there is, Nathan. I mean, if you ask Gartner whether they want to be in some of the realms that Futurum are in, they would say absolutely no. IDC's divesting of Foundry. They're saying they don't want to be in the media business. So I think probably only Futurum wants to be in everything. But I mean,
I wouldn't say that, Stephen. Yeah.
Yeah, we've got the guy on the line right now that says, no, I don't want to be in everything.
I just wanted to highlight one thing. And, buy-side influence is not the only influence that matters. And I think that's something you both just highlighted.
It's also the hardest to measure. But
the hardest to measure unless you talk about it in your public earnings call, right? So it's the hardest to measure. And like you said, different outcomes beget different analyst engagement opportunities.
As we're getting towards, I think around the 30-minute mark now, right? Right. I wanted to pull a couple of threads that will lead us into our final question. Dan, we know that Futurum and a lot of the independent analysts make a lot of content publicly available, right? And I think that's super strategic with AI, just because, like, if you're doing a search in whatever your favorite AI choice is, right, and that person isn't coming up as it's no longer a Google search, it's now like tell me about this thing and who are the people, it's almost like you don't exist, right? And that is one of the drivers of what's changing everything. So
Sure.
in that, let's talk about change and what do you expect to see in the next 5 years, maybe across the analyst ecosystem in AR? What are the sort of levers there?
Yeah, so I think you hit on a really interesting point there, Crystal. Listen, I think with LLMs coming up and effectively, kind of commoditizing all the information on the public internet, I think the business models of a lot of analyst firms will be really challenged, right? I mean, I talked about this earlier, but the way people consume information is changing. I mean, the days of logging into a website to do a Boolean search and use filters to get to a 35-page PDF that you will read discreetly, that's a little bit of the consumption pattern of the past in a lot of ways, right? I think I think there's a new model emerging where, a subscription with an analyst firm is really almost a time-bound license to that firm's IP, which you can consume via, a chatbot or agent type of interface that you can, layer on top of your, enterprise data on top of a large open LLM. I mean, I really think about stacking kind of your IP, got kind of all of the, you can pick your model of choice, maybe your OpenAI, maybe your Meta, maybe your Anthropic, all the model suppliers out there. Everybody's going to have their choice. Then tuning that, either via RAG or other methods with your enterprise data, and then layering in all the data that you buy out on the open market, including from analyst firms. I mean, I think that consumption pattern to me feels more like where the world is going. And so, I think analyst firms that have that flexibility to say, yes, you can go download my PDF, or you can interact with the data through, a GPT style chat interface, or you can embed my IP, into your enterprise model, because, the legacy model is, a lot of analyst firms, you can effectively subscribe them as, it's gated data and research behind a paywall of which, mostly other vendors live, right? So, you mentioned earlier, we do a fair amount of work in the public eye. I mean, to me, as a former customer, that was always really valuable, because an analyst firm writing something positive and something my company agrees with is really only valuable to me if the people I'm trying to reach can see it. And when it's behind a paywall and the audience I'm trying to reach doesn't live behind that paywall, that's not really that valuable to me. So, I think, at Futurum, we're certainly embracing this kind of new paradigm. We do a fair amount of work in the public eye, which I think our customers value, because we're able to really reach audiences that they're trying to reach. We hold some of our more sensitive IP behind the paywall, because I think customers want to see that value of the data and the in-depth research there. But we're also really embracing, the ability to interact with that, data and IP through a LLM style chat interface, as well as, embed our IP in your enterprise model to consume alongside all the other data you have. I just don't see a world in which creating these siloed, IP, data silos that don't interact with all of the data you've got in other places. I don't really see that world being one in which customers are going to get the same amount of value going forward.
Right. And as people are just changing buyers and consumers of information, right? The giant PDFs are just something that most buyers are just not going to go through as well. I mean, there's that aspect of consumption and humans' cognitive abilities, very broadly
Yeah, I think
speaking.
it somewhat ignores the many changes we've seen, in terms of how people consume information, right? If you're not seeing it in your social scroll, a short form snippet, maybe a quick video clip, an infographic that's grabbing your attention and kind of off ramping you to that longer form, more in-depth content. I think people generally aren't finding it unless they're finding it that, kind of through that type of method.
Stephen.
We need to wrap this up. I think we could talk to Dan for hours. One final question and then we'll wrap. Dan, where do you see this industry going? We've talked about it in broad terms, but if you were to have a crystal ball, wind forward sort of 5 years, a crystal ball, yes, I realize what I just said there. uh, you've got the ability to look into the future. Where do you see the industry 5 years from now? You've got that perspective from IBM of the trajectory they were on. I think you've joined one of the most innovative and forward-looking firms out there, who's probably leading the charge around a lot of the transformation. So I think you've got a unique perspective, Dan. Where do you see things going from here?
So I think there's a few kind of macro trends that are really, shaping the industry, right? I mean, AI, is undeniable. A lot of the, kind of low-hanging fruit type of work is really, able to be quickly kind of automated. And so, I think that will continue to be really disruptive when it comes to, enabling much smaller outfits to, derive a lot bigger value, right? You no longer need thousands of people in every country across the world gathering data. I mean, AI is very good at gathering up data, synthesizing that data, and making it really easily consumable. So, I think it's really going to be those firms that have proprietary data, that is outside kind of the big public internet data that is, populating these LLMs. Proprietary data becomes even more important. Uh, Really, the ability to reach audiences is going to be really important, whether that's a buyer audience, a vendor audience, a partner audience, a developer audience, a media audience, an investor audience. You think about all of the people outside of a tech vendor that a tech vendor is interested in reaching. Having that proprietary data, having that audience become really critical. But in a world where you know information moves so quickly and the ability to create content is so easy, it's really going to be trust, I think, that differentiates it going forward. Whether it's vendors, whether it's buyers, whether it's any of those other audiences we've talked about, people want to work with people they know and trust. And I think trust becomes even more important in a world where fake news and misreads of of the daily information flow are so prevalent, right? I mean, I think we see this every day where a snippet of information comes out, it massively penetrates social networks and broadcast media, print media. And it takes an expert coming in an hour later when their meeting ended, and they can kind of correct the market misread to kind of send that proper signal into the market. So there's an incredible amount of noise out there. Analysts really, need to develop an ability to, put out trustworthy signal and amplify that signal out to the audiences that vendors are trying to reach. I mean, I think that's really, kind of where we're destined to go.
I couldn't think of a better way to wrap us up. You've been listening to another episode of AR Chat with Dan O'Brien from the Futurum Group. Please click and subscribe and do all those things. Share the episodes with your colleagues. We're trying to build a community here. We'll see you next time. Thank you very much for watching.
I love what you guys are doing. This is really great. I appreciate you having me on.
Thanks, Dan.